Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Smoke Break webinar. This is practical strategies to support the health of 2S LGBTQIA plus people who smoke. Thanks for waiting for a couple moments there as we got all set up. And if we haven't met before, my name is Julia Falco. I use the pronouns she and they, and I am the program manager for Smoke Break. So we have about 150 people tuning in today. So to get a sense of where you're joining from, we're going to launch a poll. So I'll wait a moment for my colleague to launch our poll here. Maybe, maybe not. Um, and in the meantime, I know that you are a real vast group of service providers here in the room. So we've got nurse practitioners, harm reduction workers, oncologists, quit coaches. We've got public health, mental health, as well as students, academics, and of course, community members. So, whether you're joining us from your clinic, workplace, or your home, and whether that's in St. John's, Newfoundland, Dunnville, Ontario, or Kamloops, PC, you are an important part of the conversation and an important part of the puzzle. So, we are coming together today really from across Turtle Island, from unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, from coast to coast to coast. For myself, I'm someone who benefits from living and working on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory. This land is currently known as Ottawa, which is derived from the Algonquin word Adawe, meaning to trade, as this land where three rivers meet has long been a place of gathering and exchange. And today we're gathering virtually, recognizing Indigenous peoples as the original stewards and knowledge keepers of these lands since time immemorial. And as we come together today to discuss smoking cessation and harm reduction, we honor Indigenous teachings and relationships to tobacco as sacred medicine used in ceremony, prayer, and reciprocity with Creator, land, and community. Sacred tobacco is distinct from commercial cigarettes and vaping products, which are rooted in systems of industrial production, profit, and dependency. So we recognize the colonization and commercialization of tobacco, which continues to deepen health inequities onto Indigenous communities. And so while this session is really focused on smoking cessation and harm reduction related to commercial tobacco, our speakers and panelists today may draw on teachings and connections to traditional tobacco. And I encourage you to check out the Sacred Tobacco Community Toolkits. And you can learn more at this link to learn about revitalizing tobacco as a sacred plant. So, as we move into today's conversation, we want to approach this session holding dignity and care at the center of our space. So, this means dignity and care for the land, for one another, and for the diverse experiences that bring us here together. And creating this type of space means being clear about privacy and participation. So today's session is being recorded. Panelists will be visible on screen, and you as a participant don't need to be visible unless you choose to turn your camera on during discussion. The chat is visible to everyone in the session, so please be mindful not to share personal or identifying information, either about yourself or others. And we encourage thoughtful engagement that supports curiosity and community care. And on that note, this topic can touch on personal experiences related to smoking, vaping, substance use, and trauma. So please take care of yourself during the session. That means step away if you need to, or engage in ways that feel okay for you. Lastly, a few brief housekeeping notes before we get started. So the chat is open for comments and reflections throughout, so we encourage you to jump in there with any thoughts. We'll use the Q&A function of Zoom for questions that are specifically for the panelists, and closed captioning is available via the Zoom platform. We are committed to accessibility, so if there is something we can do for you in this space, please message me directly. And if you experience any barriers once we get started, let us know in the chat. So thank you in advance for helping us really create a space today that is grounded in dignity, learning, and care. And with that, let's begin. I will pass it over to my colleague, Kate. Oh, you're on mute, Kate. Classic.
Of course I am. What better way to start a presentation to some of like your long-term people that you've known for a really long time who are also coming to this presentation? What better way than start things on mute? Um, Good to see you, everybody. My name is Kate Fish, and I use she, her pronouns. And today I'm joining you from the Comox First Nations territory on Vancouver Island, otherwise known as Courtney. And I'm the peer support coordinator with the Smoke Break program. And I bring with me different lived experiences, as well as over 12 years doing substance use, mental health, and other um, kind of related work before coming here. And this has been a fantastic role to be in, and I'm really excited to share more about Smoke Break with you. So yeah, the purpose of this session is to provide some background information and practical ways to support 2S LGBTQ plus people who smoke commercial tobacco or vape nicotine. This conversation matters because 2S LGBTQ plus communities smoke and vape at higher rates than cisgender and heterosexual populations. But we are often erased, excluded, or even harmed in the very services meant to support people who smoke or vape. This is due to large-scale things like systemic barriers, but also more interpersonal ones like unconscious bias. So we're going to get into that today. So Canadian research actually shows that 2S LGBTQ plus people smoke and vape again at significantly higher rates. But in Canada, we see rates at about 34% of the community reporting smoking and 28% vaping. This is compared with national rates of 10.9% and 5.8%. Some subpopulations within the 2S LGBTQ plus community experience even higher rates of smoking and vaping, with smoking in particular for bisexual people at around 45% and around 44% for transgender folks. And despite this need, so this is like a well-known thing um, in across many settings. But despite this need, programs by and for our communities are rare. So 2S LGBTQ plus people report having to educate their providers about their health needs or encountering discomfort from providers who lack training. 2S LGBTQ plus cultural competence and awareness means prioritizing individuals' experiences and goals, taking the time to learn community history and cultural differences. When services lack cultural competence, people feel unsafe and are more likely to delay or avoid care. And that affects prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and referrals. And the result of that is, what we end up seeing is higher rates of serious illnesses, including COPD, cancer, worsened mental illness, and even barriers to accessing gender-affirming surgery. Queer and trans people have the right to safe, quality healthcare. Culturally competent care is a powerful protective factor for well-being. As a highlight here, we're sharing a quote from one of our community advisory members. We have a community advisory that is made up of people from across the country with all sorts of different experiences. And this member has shared their experience with transphobia in healthcare. And so, just a snippet that I'll read verbally here. Going into a healthcare setting sucks because you are asked a variety of things as a gender nonconforming person that has nothing to do with the matter at hand. In my personal experience, it can range from misunderstandings, like name, identity, comfort level, to outright being ridiculed or refused service. The barriers we face from healthcare are high before we even get to the topic of smoking. And that can make us feel like shutting down before even receiving care. We may avoid giving accurate answers or addressing symptoms just to get out of the doctor's office faster. So, smoking and vaping are often connected to stress, trauma, and violence. Unfortunately, 2S LGBTQ plus people experience disproportionate levels of these things, which can also be referred to as minority stress. The factors that influence smoking and vaping occur at many levels, at individual, relational, community, and societal. And they're shaped also by queerness, queer culture, social spaces, systemic exclusion, and intersecting identities such as race, disability, poverty, fatness, or housing instability. It's important to remember, though, of course, that not every 2S LGBTQ plus person experiences trauma the same way, experiences trauma, or experiences trauma and smokes, or any combination therein. Everyone is an individual. But this is some factors that are found to be very common, and so that's why we speak to them. And because stigma toward both 2S LGBTQ plus people and towards people who smoke or vape contributes to stress and violence across many settings, including healthcare itself. So, while many people who are exposed to trauma experience little to no ongoing symptoms, experiencing repeated, chronic, and or multiple traumas increases risk of traumatic stress reactions and negatively impacts the sense of identity and sense of safety. This is known as re-traumatization. I've shared some examples of contributors to re-traumatization on the slide, but some systemic examples of that could be not having a choice in service or treatment, exclusion from healthcare forms or records, underrepresentation in health research, to more relational things like use of coercive practices, identity-based profiling, or microaggressions. Re-traumatization happens when something recreates aspects of a person's past trauma and activates the body's survival response. And for people with higher exposure to traumatic histories, experiences, and environments, they'll have a higher drive to escape or mitigate those harms those traumas represent. Smoking, vaping, and other substance use can be absolutely self-protective in re-traumatizing contexts. Avoiding contexts that could be re-traumatizing, like healthcare, is another way of self-protecting. So if trauma and stress shape how people use nicotine, how should we respond? One important approach is trauma and violence informed care, or TVIC, we'll refer to it as. For those of you who work in health and social settings, this might be something that's familiar to you, but maybe this is new or you need a refresher. Trauma and violence informed care recognizes that traumatic experiences can shape how people engage with services, even when those experiences are not visible. trauma and violence informed care uses a universal precaution approach, just like we do with blood, um, but different. But the universal precaution approach, aims to reduce harm for everybody and to avoid re-traumatization for everyone, regardless of whether we know their history. It does not require disclosure. Trauma and violence informed principles include safety for both physical and emotional well being, trust with clear information and choice, um, and supporting autonomy. It includes collaboration, so working together with people, and empowerment, or recognizing people's strengths and building a sense of hope. Hope is a really powerful tool, and it's something that we actually talk about and see a lot in our work with folks in Smoke Break. When trauma and violence informed care is applied to 2S LGBTQ plus communities, it means working to understand and be with people of diverse 2S LGBTQ plus identities that respect that come with respect, humility, and affirmation. And this is really similar to harm reduction. So, harm reduction approach to tobacco and vaping sees a world where everyone who smokes or vapes, whether or not they want or are able to quit, are provided with a means to reduce related harms. Harm reduction is often treated like a buzzword, but it's actually an important set of principles for how we interact with people. Meaning, harm reduction is about focusing on human rights and dignity. It's about practical or pragmatic support to reduce harms. It's not abstract, it's concrete. Focus on harms, including discrimination and social inequities, maximizing options to support self-determination and control, involvement of peers and people with lived and living experience in the creation of programs and policies, as well as priority of immediate goals. Harm reduction and trauma and violence informed care overlap in important ways. They both focus on safety, autonomy, and meeting people where they are. This also means respecting and supporting self-determination without coercing someone towards a predetermined goal. Harm reduction actually has deep roots in Black queer organizing in the United States. And in Canada, it grew during the HIV/AIDS crisis when communities stepped in to care for one another in the face of systemic neglect. This work continues to be led by 2S LGBTQ plus communities, Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks, sex workers, and people who use drugs, particularly people who use drugs that are criminalized or illicit, who experience disproportionate harms way beyond or much different than tobacco or nicotine do as legalized and regulated substances. It's different, but the principles and the practice around harm reduction are the same. Harm reduction approaches can be applied anywhere along the continuum of substance use, from no use to dependence. And people can move along that, really actually not so much in a continuum, but more of a spectrum over time. And to show this is called the substance use spectrum. I hope it's not too small, but I can always share this later on. But it basically is showing that there is a spectrum from non-use, beneficial use, lower risk use, higher risk use, and dependence. And it acknowledges that there are lots of different reasons why people use drugs, and that's okay. And there are different levels of harm at different, points along the spectrum, but that harm reduction can actually be used no matter where someone is on that spectrum. There's a common misconception that harm reduction doesn't support people who want to quit entirely, but that's not true. It's just that harm reduction also recognizes that change and kind of a harm reduction approach can happen in many different ways along the continuum, and that things might not be linear. It might be, twisty turny all over the place. But viewing substance use as a spectrum provides a broader perspective, again, that acknowledges varying experiences, benefits, and harms. Risk level can be moderated by things like criminalization and drug policy. And in tobacco and nicotine use, harm reduction really means sharing information and options to people so that they can choose what works best for them. That might not mean quitting, and that's okay. If it is quitting, that's also okay. We can help to find ways to reduce harm along the whole the whole path. So again, I just want to finish up on this to say harm reduction isn't in opposition to quitting. It is a way of approaching substance use that sees it as a complex, universal part of the human experience. So there are a few barriers to accessing smoking and vaping support. We've already covered a number of those things in terms of accessing healthcare generally, but there are also some specific considerations when it comes to smoking and vaping for the 2S LGBTQ plus community. So some of those things would be no access to just general healthcare or a regular doctor or nurse practitioner. Some people struggle with the cost and perceived efficacy of nicotine replacement therapy. There's also the pathologization and criminalization of sexual orientation and gender identity. It hasn't been long since same-sex acts were criminalized or pathologized by the DSM. So, like, for instance, homosexuality wasn't fully removed from the DSM, which is like the what psychiatrists and doctors use to diagnose psychiatric disorders. It wasn't fully removed until late 1973, and conversion practices still occur. Gender identity disorder was changed in 2013 to gender dysphoria, which still focuses on pathologization and doesn't recognize that there is also gender euphoria. And in terms of the criminalization side of things, it was only in 1969 that same-sex acts between adults 21 and older were legalized, albeit only in private and only with two people. So have been restrictions in people's lifetimes that impact how they access healthcare and systems of power. There's also potentially co-occurring past or present substance use and lack of available mental health supports, ambivalence to the availability of current smoking and vaping support. And there's also a desire to know about whether or not there is a shared identity with a service provider. So people really like to know, am I going to be in a place where I can be in relation with that provider in some sort of way? We also know that there is unconscious bias and stigma, and those play a role in re-traumatization and barriers to healthcare. Unconscious bias is an automatic assumption that we make about someone without realizing it, and it might even be a stereotype that you actively reject. You don't notice you're doing it, and it's something modeled and learned from our environment, but it's worth keeping an eye out for yourself and for others about where you might hold some of these. So some examples are things like a provider assuming the bisexual patient just needs to pick a side or is in a phase. A doctor trusts a cisgender patient's patient more than a trans patient's, and so on. This is an example again from another community advisory community community advisory committee member about their experience of judgment when accessing healthcare. And I'll just read a little excerpt here. So, I believe it is a challenge to get people to sit down and reflect on what their own unconscious bias are towards our community. Sometimes people apply their experience with one person to everyone in that community or of that identity, or they expect something based on a trend they feel like they've noticed among a community, instead of understanding each person as the entirely unique person they are. So there are some strengths and weaknesses to the traditional cessation models. And so when we say traditional cessation models, we mean approaches to smoking and vaping that are high barrier, time bound, and heavily structured and focused on quitting any nicotine use. These programs have some real strengths in that they're focused on long-term behavior change, widely available, and usually staffed by nurses. But for many 2S LGBTQ plus people, these models also have significant limitations. And that could be many programs predetermine the goal, which is quitting nicotine entirely, which is a very binary approach. Structurally, programs can also be very difficult to access with long registration forms, delayed callback systems, or limited and rigid access to nicotine replacement therapy. And relationally, programs are often created without meaningful input from people who actually smoke or vape, which means that programs can unintentionally reinforce shame, guilt, and disengagement. And so, what if we had a program that kind of was actually tailored for our community? And that's what was created with Smoke Break. And so it acknowledged that some of the current models of support weren't really effectively serving the 2S LGBT community. Smoke Break, it's by us, for us. It embodies a nursing designed, community refined, peer led harm reduction program that is trauma and violence informed and neuroaffirming. Neuroaffirming means that it is supportive and affirming for people who are neurodivergent. Our program validates stress from 2S LGBTQ plus discrimination as real drivers of smoking patterns, but also honoring positive associations like community connection and ritual, and encouraging self-reflection on evolving relationships with smoking and vaping. We're also very flexible with how we offer support virtually, either by video, phone, or people can have their video off, do it by chat, whatever works to accommodate sensory needs. And we also provide free NRT and other supplies without judgment to support autonomous choices. And we validate people's strengths and past experiences. So we really support people wherever they want to go. And the people who are participating determine that. They might want to quit, they might want to reduce, both are fine, or they might just want to talk about it. People who don't want to change right now are still welcome, as are those who use multiple substances. Learning about and examining individual smoking and vaping is a way of improving health. So we support folks who have been, maybe not fitting into other kind of health and social programs. And by that, I mean not fitting the rigid structure. And so it's kind of where, again, Smoke Break fills that gap. It's like we see you, we are you. We enthusiastically support people who have, quote unquote, failed traditional cessation models, people who have felt judged or dismissed in healthcare settings, people navigating all sorts of things related to chronic stress and marginalization, and people who want support without being told what to do. Being told what to do, no one really enjoys that. Being able to decide what you would like to do and getting support in how to get there is usually something that's a bit more sustainable for folks. And we know that coming to a program like this or program intake can be anxious and stressful. So we work to really develop a sense of connection, possibility, and safety from the minute we meet with them. So many people leave the intake instead of being anxious and stressed, they leave excited to start, hopeful and optimistic. And we're really able to do this because our team is supported to show up as whole people, where we don't pretend to be neutral or detached, and our lived experience is treated as expertise, not bias. Um, and smoke break participants have said that having a dedicated space to talk about smoking authentically has been really transformative. And smoke break has increased awareness and then helped set fair goals for themselves. Also, hella gender affirming. Someone else really appreciates that this program isn't all or nothing, and that even though this person smoked again, we're not pressuring them to quit right away. And other people also provide testament to the neurodivergent care component. So what are some ways to address these gaps? So smoke break is certainly an approach to that. And so we would recommend adding smoke break to your program resources. Smoke break is available to anybody who is over 18, belongs to the 2S LGBTQ plus community, lives in Canada, and is interested in exploring the relationship with smoking or vaping. You can find more information on our website or by scanning this QR code for our referral package. Although people can self-refer into the program, if you're a provider, you can also make referrals in to make things a bit more direct. And I'd encourage you to increase your knowledge of, advocate for, and practice trauma and violence informed care, harm reduction principles, cultural competency and awareness. Um, 18 plus. Sorry, it's actually 18 plus. So for eligibility, it's not over 18, it is 18 and older for the program. Sorry. Um, and I would encourage you to seek perspectives from 2S LGBTQ plus people that smoke and vape. And when you do so, provide them with honorariums. So pay them for their time and their expertise. And provide good information and choice, not rules or set plans. This is harm reduction. Harm reduction is good information and choice. That is a key part. If you can do nothing else, good information and choice, very, very important. And consider completing an unconscious bias assessment or even explicit bias assessment, and then work to address gaps. You can do that individually or as an organization. And then you can also start to take steps to demonstrate that your services are aware of 2S LGBTQ plus programs and that you support them. So having posters like this up or on your social media can be part of kind of like indicating that. And those are in the referral package that Hannah just shared in the chat. And finally, before I shut my mouth. I am happy to say that today we are launching a new resource that might answer a lot of your like practical hands-on strategies for working with individuals, because we've released a harm reduction focused guide for 2S LGBTQ plus people who smoke, vape, or use nicotine alongside other substances and are thinking about making changes. So this is really exciting. It's been developed in collaboration with community advisory group members, and so many people with lived experience, and it is a continuation of the practical tools to support folks. So I really encourage you to take a look, and I'll hand it over to the panelists now.
Hi, folks. My name is Chris Dranos. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling from Treaty 13, what's commonly referred to as Toronto. Today, in this panel discussion, we'll be covering practical strategies related to themes of stress and trauma-informed practice, shame, guilt, and non-judgmental care, and harm reduction. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our amazing panelists, a group of leaders whose work reflects the deep commitment to community care and to us LGBTQIA+ well-being. So first we welcome Albert McLeod, a Korean First Nations activist with over 30 years of experience championing Two-Spirit Indigenous 2S LGBTQIA plus rights. Albert co-founded the Two-Spirited People of Manitoba and continues to advise on Indigenous cultural and health initiatives nationwide. Next, we have Prudence Ndwani, an educator and coach whose work spans Southern Africa, Australia, and Canada. Prudence focuses on trauma, belonging, and creating care that welcomes people as they are, not as systems expect them to be. And finally, welcome Ruben MJ Tarahano, a harm reduction worker based in Toronto with 8 years of experience in 2S LGBTQ plus health and outreach. Ruben coordinates Pieces to Pathways, Canada's first peer-led substance use support program for queer and trans youth. So thank you all for being here and sharing your insights with us today, and let's get started. So in the first theme, stress and trauma-informed practice, we often talk about being trauma-informed in our work, but that's such a broad term with a range of meanings. So Prudence, really wanted to ask you, how would you take a trauma-informed approach to changing smoking behaviors?
Thank you, Chris. To answer that question, we would need to ground it in the reality of the work, not just the theory. As Kate noted earlier, when we say trauma-informed, we first have to be honest about what trauma really is. Many people think trauma is something dramatic and visible, like a car accident or physical violence. And while that may be trauma, our community feels more trauma with systems, with relational aspects. It's being rejected for who you are. It's racism, it's homophobia, it's transphobia, it's migration stress. It's being in systems where you're not seen, not heard, not believed. It's promises that keep being made and taken away repeatedly to the point where a person's sense of safety and trust is constantly disrupted. So trauma is not just a single event. It's a series of experiences that force people to adapt in order to survive. And when people adapt, their nervous systems adapt with them. This is where we see the fight, the flight, the freeze, or the fawn. And these are not behaviors that people choose. These are survival responses. So when we work with someone who smokes, we shouldn't see a smoker. We need to see somebody whose body has learned how to cope. Because smoking for many people is regulation. We sit with people who, after an argument, will say, "Oh, I need to go out for a smoke." We sit with people who've had a stressful day at work and need to go out for a smoke, or when they go out, they need to have a smoke. And this is especially true in queer communities, because having navigated rejection, bullying, and isolation, and losing some family support, many face discrimination in their schools, in healthcare systems, and in workplace systems. For queer people of color or immigrants, those experiences are layered with racism, displacement, and economic stress. So when we see higher smoking rates, like Kate spoke about before, in those communities, we shouldn't see poor choices. We see people managing a higher load of stress, often with fewer safe supports. That understanding is why programs like Smoke Break work, because they don't start from judgment, they start from reality. They recognize that people are not resistant, they're protecting themselves. So in our approach, we shift the narrative completely. We do not approach the smoking as bad behavior. We approach it as coping behavior. Because the truth is, smoking works. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. It helps somebody calm down, it helps them regulate, and it gets them through a difficult moment. The problem is that it comes with the long-term consequences. And when we say that out loud, something shifts. People stop feeling judged. They stop feeling like they have to defend themselves or defend their behavior. They realize, I'm not crazy for choosing this. I chose what I had available to me at the time. And then from there, our role is not to take that coping strategy away. Our role is to expand the options. And I'm sure Ruben is going to speak about that when he's talking about the harm reduction. So we approach the work with curiosity instead of judgment. We ask what role smoking is playing in their life. We focus on building safety and trust because without that, there is no change. We meet people exactly where they are, whether they want to quit, to reduce, or are not ready at all. And most importantly, we support regulation before we behavior change. Because if someone is overwhelmed or dysregulated, no matter how much advice, it will never land. When people feel safe, they often feel understood and they have other ways to cope. And then that is when change becomes possible. And that is what trauma-informed looks like in practice.
Thank you. That's really insightful. And, I think as a provider, I ask like behavior-based questions and tend not to get into a lot of the like details. And so, it really makes you like think more broadly than that. Just like any practical strategies that you can share with our audience today that like might change how they would approach. I know you like shared kind of like the like broader things, but
Yep.
any like tidbits that you have, we would love to hear those.
From my perspective, practical means meeting the individual where they are. I wouldn't, it means if you're dealing with somebody who's trying to quit, for instance, and smokes a lot when they go out, you're not going to give them a strategy and say, okay, you need to meditate. That's not going to work for them when they're out with partying or with their friends. It needs to be something where you're looking at the person and saying, okay, what's your trigger? Let's look at that. What triggers you? When do you find you need the most sense to smoke? When do you feel the pull to smoke? And then when you look at that, that's when you can start looking at what other options can we give you except for reaching out for that smoke. If someone is stressed at work, you're not going to want to take away their cigarettes at that moment in time when they're stressed. But maybe you can reduce the smoking later on during the day and say, okay, instead of carrying a full pack, carry less. So the worst thing to do is a blanket approach where you say, okay, a practical solution is everybody needs to use patches or everybody needs to do this. It won't work. You need to talk to the person as an individual. And this is why I respect the work that Kate and them are doing, because it really meets the person where they are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing about that. We'll hear more from Prudence in a little bit. But we really wanted to move on to talk a bit about shame, guilt, and non-judgmental care. So I'll invite Albert to be part of this discussion. So, as we've talked about, like most behavior change messaging for smoking, very cessation focused and describes like these harms and absolutes. What are and we know that this doesn't really work well for human beings. What are some of the ways that we can remove the shame and guilt while still supporting people and making healthier choices related to their smoking behavior?
I think, our journey in life is a very complicated one. And we're met with many parts of the environment. And for myself, the aspect of air, earth, fire, and water really is an experience for me. And as Prudence said, we use things that work for us at the time. It could be, cigarettes, alcohol, whatever. And that's part of being human. So we're really driven by our emotions and our feelings, our psychology, but also our spirit. What I like to do is reconnect with my feelings. In the analysis of feelings, there are many feelings that are perceived as being negative ones, and the nicer ones are less. But I think those negative ones come really from a place of protectionism or survival, because we had to be cautious when we were hunting or whatever. So we were always suspicious. And just realize that a lot of the triggers about our feelings about substance use, including tobacco, is guilt and shame. Like, why am I doing this? Why can't I stop? You know, what impression am I making? But also realizing, reconnect with your feelings. And I think that's a good pathway. And just realize that social pressure really focuses on the negative, right? Is you need to be this, you need to be that, just as conforming, but look at those positive feelings as well in your everyday life. You know, I used to smoke. I started smoking at 15 and I quit when I was 30. So that was 40 years ago. But in my relationship with the plant tobacco, it has not ended. You know, people offer me tobacco constantly because I'm at ceremonies. I have a ceremonial pipe where I do smoke tobacco. And so it is the universe that decides that relationship, right? And my house is full of tobacco, but I don't smoke. So that's a point of view in life, is that you could create a relationship with tobacco or any other substance and understand what that relationship is at a deeper level, a psychological, emotional, and spiritual level. And then ultimately you decide what that relationship is. So to me, you know, 40 years later, tobacco is still a large part of my life. It's you know, essence has changed. But I think, as I said, you know, we have a relationship with our ecosystem, whether we're urban, you know, rural, on reserve, northern, or remote. You know, the plants in our life feed us, whether we're having a kale salad or, you know, that ecosystem is all around us. And as we learn, it is what kind of relationship or nuanced relationship do I want to have with that ecosystem, whether it's water. We're all drinking bottled water now because we don't trust tap water. So there's just culture, right? And you know, so some of these very traditional teachings across cultures are important because fire and smoke have been a part of people's lives for thousands of years. You know, whether it's a barbecue today, a candle, incense, or a fireplace for comfort, right? And so it really is that perception of what's around you and what are your feelings about these things, and then what options do you have. So sometimes, you know, the indigenous legend about the Ojibwe creation spirit story. In the story, the muskrat goes down in the dark, cold water to find the old earth. And that is a fable. And the teaching is that sometimes we are called to go inside ourselves, right? To find the solutions to our struggles. It may not be external, it may be inside our psyche, our emotions, our soul, to find these solutions. So I try to bridge all of these aspects together in this journey with any part of the environment. You know, we have marijuana as a plant. Grapes come from, you know, wine comes from grapes. That's a plant. So it is that more sophisticated relationship with our ecosystem, our ecology, and that we're humans, and it's a journey. And you know, you're on that spectrum, as Kate shared. We're all on a spectrum, and you know, it's our right and gift to explore all of it, right? In the case of smoking. Yeah, I want to just share that.
No, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And I really appreciate the complete overview and catching so many different angles. Just quickly before we move on to harm reduction, do you have any thoughts on you know, so you know, this kind of this spectrum of relapse and stopping relapse that people go through? What are some non-judgmental ways to keep people engaged when they relapse to previous smoking behaviors?
Well, I think you let them take the lead, whether they want to discuss the relapse or not. And, you know, we don't always have to put our whole life on display in an engagement in a relationships, whether it's personal, professional, or in an intimate relationship. And, you know, let the person who is driving the ship, let them introduce it if it's an issue, if they want to talk about it, right? Or just let it pass, right? And people are confident enough to bring it up, if they want to, they will. So it's just that patience. Patience is really one of the Indigenous philosophies, being patient, because sometimes things happen in a year, 2 years, 10 years that you see that epiphany or you see that enlightenment. So patience is really a big part of our harm reduction approach.
Mhm. Thank you so much. These are all really insightful thoughts. So really appreciate it. So thank you, Albert. We'll get back to you with this with the Q&A, but we're going to move on to talking about harm reduction. And so I'd like to invite Ruben to this part of the chat. So, really, when we're discussing harm reduction, we often think about like opioid crisis, and really, as we've like discussed in this, harm reduction is so much broader than that. And when we think about like the fact that, as discussed, that like smoking behaviors have not changed as significantly in the 2S LGBTQI plus community as compared to the general population. If we recall, it was about 34% to 10.9%, so almost 3 times higher. So like, what are some actual like harm reduction approaches, and why are these harm reduction approaches needed to support 2S LGBTQI plus communities in changing smoking behaviors?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think, Kate has covered a lot on this, especially around harm reduction, trauma-informed care, and just to stress the why. Again, the importance of meeting people where they're at. Harm reduction approaches are so necessary, especially when it comes to queer folks, of course, not only for the disparities that we see in the data, but also to be supportive of queer and trans folks through their journeys. A lot of health intervention strategies were designed with, white, affluent, neurodivergent, able-bodied people in mind. And these intersections were often, confounding variables or screened out. And so what's really important not only is to understand that, the lack of strategic, culturally sensitive, culturally competent care, but also the histories of trauma and institutional mistrust in relation to these power structures. So these histories of power imbalance with criminalization and pathologization lends to us to challenge that as providers, as peers, as colleagues, as friends, loved ones, to lean into collaboration and empowerment rather than paternalism or assumptions or bias. And a lot of my colleagues here have already named a lot of these practical strategies, but really leaning into the fact that one size fits all solutions don't work for everyone. I think understanding that everyone's journey is non-linear. And so we want to empower folks to be their own decision makers. And there's the micro and the macro that I might get into a bit more. But I was also going to add that, again, like it's a coping mechanism for a lot of folks in response to stress, violence, and trauma. And so really seeing this in the bigger picture is so, so crucial. And understanding that a lot of folks at the end of the day want to see improvement in their health and well-being. And it's about empowering them in their decision making with access to knowledge and really helping folks get a robust toolkit. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think, we've definitely talked a lot about some different examples of like harm reduction. So I do want to maybe just jump in. We've had a lot of questions around vaping and Zins or Zonic, and so like these pouches as well, for those of you who are unfamiliar. And just wondering about like any thoughts you have around like messaging for vaping and Zins, and anything that you have like that you wanted to share about that?
Yes, for sure. I think when we add the youth lens here, it's really important to invest in creative strategies. Um, with TikTok, for example, a certain brand that will not be named of nicotine pouches has gotten, I think, 700 million interactions online, and evidence has already shown that sales have increased after a wave of social media engagement. So, on the more macro level, if you will, I think it's really important for public health interventions, messaging, and to incorporate social media, app-based technologies. And I think we can take inspiration and borrow from peers in other harm reduction related fields, such as HIV and STBBI care, with collaborating and fostering community spaces. And some studies have shown, especially with queer and trans youth, as it relates to vaping, the importance of messaging that is empowering and oftentimes appeals to positive emotions. You know, a lot of anti-smoking, anti-vaping messaging out there, while fact and evidence-based, and that is really, really important, sometimes its shortcoming is not so focused on making a smoke-free or vape-free life appealing, you know, highlighting those benefits, and appealing again to those positive emotions. So I could go on a lot about vaping, but I know that there's also ever emerging evidence out there. So for example, I think that's really important to be clear and address any kind of misinformation. Um, And for example, an awareness that nicotine replacement therapy isn't necessarily just for people who smoke, but can also be used by people who vape. And I think it's really important for providers, you know, to do research on their own, you know, and not be wary of off-label pharmacotherapy solutions and, you know, offering clients and patients options. And, you know, they can add that to their toolkit. And if medication is hesitation, there's even cytosine, for example, as over the counter. Um, so I think that awareness and understanding and sort of dispelling myths that are out there is super important as it relates to vaping as well. Um, and yeah, I think other folks have already said it, but messaging for people who smoke won't necessarily be the same as messaging for people who vape. And that won't be the same, that won't be the same messaging for people who have never smoked or vaped. So again, I think information is power. And you know, there's a vaping harm reduction tip sheet out there in the world that, for example, helps people understand safer use. And teaching someone for how to properly use an e-cigarette device is not enabling their use. I think that's also a part of harm reduction is, you know, teaching somebody the how of safer use is not necessarily, you know, encouraging the quote unquote harm, but is really in preventing improper use and preventing the harms that that lack of knowledge could result in. So that could look like even little things like preventing your device from overheating, preventing buildup, uh, perhaps knowing the shelf life of what you're using, you know, not using something that's unlabeled or old. And there's a lot of folks out there who also will DIY a disposable device. And, you know, keeping a device disposable sometimes can, you know, prevent some of those harms. So these are just a few examples. I think with nicotine pouches in particular, I know that's the big trend and the big topic of discussion. I think we'll have to see uh, as things come out, sort of but we are seeing, you know, among youth, I think in Canada, I could be wrong on this exact number, please don't quote me, but I think ever use is about 9%. And I think a big key of it is the discretion. And I think there's a lot of messaging. Again, these the private sector and these companies are very good sometimes at marketing. And I think it's important for us to take two truths into consideration. One, you know, it's a non-combustion, non-commercial tobacco-based product. And yes, that can be used for folks who might want to use it as a harm-reducing strategy, if they are smoking or vaping, for example. But on the other hand, it's not a risk-free
Mhm.
method. So I think we have to balance these
Yeah,
two things.
definitely. Thank you so much. Those are some amazing examples and some amazing thoughts. And so I really do appreciate that. So now I'd actually just like to move on to some questions from the chat and also that we received on registration. First question we actually received in registration was actually a lot of questions about triggers and coping strategies. I'm really just going to do a shameless plug, like sign up for Smoke Break, and we'll work with you in an individualized way around that. And I think that really the hope for the message that and that not the one size fits all really came through today. So the first question, and this for Albert. So someone asked in the chat. So they said this may depend on the nation or elder, but would it be helpful to ask knowledge keepers which sacred medicines they would like for offerings? I also give tobacco, but want to respect where people may be in the relationship with tobacco, smoking, or vaping. And I think we can put that in the chat too, just in case you want to read that.
Yeah, the history of tobacco and ceremonial use goes back very, very long, time. And sort of the contemporary protocols are around mostly for First Nations elders in an engagement, asking a question, etc., or them to participate in an event, you would offer them tobacco. And there's many forms of tobacco today in which you could offer. And really, the intention is that as elders, knowledge keepers, ceremonial people, they will offer that tobacco to the spirit world to determine what action is required with your request, right? So, they may smoke it in a pipe, but usually in a pipe ceremony, the smoke is not inhaled. It is let out again to the universe as an offering. And there's now contemporary tobaccos, like the traditional Kinnikinnick was made from different willows, and that's popular as well. And people are growing their own tobacco now and other forms of tobacco. There's not just one tobacco plant, there's other forms. And other plant medicines are also seen as spiritual, like cedar is an Algonquin or Ojibwe plant medicine in ceremony, and particularly in the smudging or purification ritual using smoke. And your best bet is to offer like some cloth and a can of fruit, peaches. You'll never go wrong.
Awesome.
So yeah,
Well,
and then for the Métis and Inuit, it's very different. You can't assume that there's one protocol for Indigenous people, and you have to ask, right, with each group, what is the protocol of engagement? And again, there's many types of tobacco. There's the Mother Earth tobacco that is naturally grown, no additives, and it is intentionally grown to be used in a sacred fire or to offer to the earth or in a pipe. So its intention is not for human use, even though it is a tobacco product for sale. It is meant for ceremonial use, and it's at a lower price than commercial tobacco, so that families have access to it and to elders and ceremonies. And we do have a little, I think Hannah has a handout I made about that.
yes, yeah, I think we just posted that in the chat.
So it's the can of fruit, no sugar. Just kidding. one thing at a time.
Yes. Thank you, Albert, for going over that. Always learn tons of information from you every time I hear you speak. So, thank you. So another question that we have that came in as part of our registration was asking what would you say to people who aren't sure if they want to quit? So I'll open that up to anyone on the panel who has any thoughts.
Well, I think it's the idea. Once you have the idea, it's like a vision in a way, because, it's an intention, and we have to value all our intentions about life and what our mind and our spirit is telling us. And certainly we may have qualms about our tobacco use, we may, be curious about it, but and I think we have to honor that curiosity, right? Whether someone chooses to not use or to use, right? Because like I said, 20 years from then, it may be different worldview. So we can never assume or presume what people's intentions are. It's a very personal journey. And it's a collective journey as well. Like I said, it's, with their children, their partner, their family, and people are conscious of that as they sort of think about life and influences in our life, because there's other substances other than tobacco that we have to consider.
Mhm. I think Ruben, you wanted to add something? Thank you,
Yeah,
Albert.
thank you, Albert. I just wanted to add on that in the case that somebody doesn't want to quit, I think curiosity is super, super important. And I think back to like one of the workshops that we had at our org where it was called For When It's No Longer Serving. So not just when a substance is no longer serving you, but also, again, the cultural competence part serving. For those who know, it can also mean something that's like attractive or impressive. Um, so asking, have you ever thought about reducing, or do you have the tools available to you that for when it's no longer serving, you would feel able to do that? So I think that curiosity and again, empowering folks with the tools is super important.
Awesome. Prudence, anything to add or?
Sure. I was also thinking that sometimes we must remember that some of these programs are not therapy, right? So when somebody is not ready, they're not ready. They're using it for something, it's a placeholder for something in their lives. And if you yank it out of their hands, what are they going to replace it with? So you have to think of the bigger picture. For that time only, you think, okay, it's fine. You're not ready to quit. Let's talk about something else. Let's not talk about the issue that you came to. Maybe they just want somebody to talk to. They want some relief in that manner. So you give it to them. It's not about forcing. I think the work we do is not about cessation. It's not about making the person feel judged. You don't want to quit? That's fine. Let's move on to something else. And when they're ready, they'll come to you.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, and then wondering if anyone on the panel, there was a question if there are any strategies tailored for bisexual and lesbian girls and women. Prudence or any of the other panelists, if you have any thoughts on this.
I can start. So, firstly, for bisexual women, that's a very broad term as well, and everybody's got their own individual experiences. So, I wouldn't want a strategy that's just for bisexual women and it's covered. I think it should be individual. And also, you must remember they also have lots of stigma that they're dealing with where maybe they're not gay enough, they're not this enough, and or they're too much. They're still struggling with identity. They're not accepted in both sides of the society. So they're dealing with that and they're smoking, and there's a lot of nuances around it. So I would meet the individual where they are. I know I've been repeating that a lot, but that's what I would do and see why are they coming up with it.
Fair enough. I'll maybe say smoke break because maybe the strategy for bisexual and lesbian girls and women. Um, and maybe just because I think we answered that. One thing, I think.
Chris, can I just add something in on that?
Sure, of course.
So we talked about this as a team, and would echo a lot of what Prudence has said in terms of the approach. But Jules also reminded us that harm reduction and trauma and violence informed care are also very much like feminist approaches to being and working with other people. Um, and that really is kind of embedded in our work. We also have like a lot of femmes on our team, and so we bring multiple kind of experiences in that way as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, So just we do actually have one last question in the chat that I wanted to address, but we'll have our program manager Julia do that in the closing. But really, at this point, I just wanted to thank Ruben, Albert, Prudence for your time, your wisdom, your expertise. I definitely learned quite a bit just listening to you, and I really hope that our audience did as well. And so I really just wanted to thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. And I'd love to stay in touch just to make sure that we can continue to learn from you and learn together as well. So really big round of applause. I know we don't have reactions set up, but we'll everyone applause in your home for our panelists. And yeah, and then just really the last question was just around thinking about gaps in smoke breaks, own service provision, and programs that we could imagine working in tandem with, and other things along those lines, just from the chat Q&A. So I'll hand that over to Julia, and then for closing, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Such a wonderful conversation. And to, speak about this last question here. We are quite a niche program, right? We are really focused on supporting this specific community. And within that community, I would say a group that we are not able to work with currently under this program is queer and trans youth who are under 18, right? So this is a question that we get. And we don't know of anyone else who is working with this community in particular, queer and trans youth. Of course, there are other programs that are broader, but this is a group that we don't currently offer services to. And I'd say the other gap in service is maybe not so much a gap, but again, just kind of the limitations of our work is that we are really only focused on smoking tobacco and nicotine, right? So there was a question there about smoking cannabis or smoking other substances that is currently not within our wheelhouse. We know that there are, of course, a various number of smoking cessation programs across the country. If you are working with one of those and we haven't been in touch yet, please do connect with us because we hope to make sure that our questions or our collaborations are and referrals can be made when and where possible. So those I would say are kind of like the two gaps. And now, as we come to a close, after hearing all of this from Kate, from our panelists, and from our moderator, Chris, I'd love to know, how did this content and conversation land with you? Maybe, Kate, if you could just jump back to our other slide there. We have a very short survey, and so I ask that you please take 3 minutes to share your feedback with myself and our team here. You can either scan the QR code that is on the screen, or you can click the link that Hannah has shared in the Zoom chat. And if you had a question that we weren't able to answer today, or if you would just like to connect, please do get in touch. Our email is on this next slide here. It's smokebreak@cbrc.net. We also have our socials there. And to wrap things up, I'd like to just extend my gratitude to our panelists, to you, Ruben, Prudence, and Albert, to our moderator, Chris, and to Kate. Thank you so much for your time, but also for these incredibly valuable insights and wisdom that you shared with us today. And lastly, thank you to everyone who is here. Thank you for your curiosity and for being a part of this conversation. We really are most powerful when we come together and work collectively as peers, as providers, as loved ones to support the health and well-being of queer and trans communities with harm reduction approaches. So thank you all so much, and until next time.